It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Quiller Nation, we are thrilled to welcome to this episode Professor Eric Heinze, Professor of Law and Humanities, as well as Executive Director of the Center for Law, Democracy and Society, School of Law, Queen Mary, University of London. Eric is also the author of several intriguing books, including The Concept of Injustice, which you can find at Amazon or other booksellers. I'm going to talk a little bit about that book today. Eric, welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger.
Hi, Stephen. It's great to see you and to be able to chat today.
I'd like to begin, if I may, with your work on The Comedy of Errors. Your commentary on this play sets it aside from other Shakespearean works in a way that I think most people never truly examine. They almost toss it aside as some lighthearted attempt to mimic the comic work of Plautus, but the play is truly so much more than that, isn't it?
Oh, well, yeah, absolutely. In fact, it seems to me that it was the mid-20th century Shakespearean Tilliard who went so far as to say that if you were trying to interpret the comedies, and in particular one like The Comedy of Errors, then you just didn't understand the play, right? That the sheer act of trying to interpret would misconstrue the fact that it wasn't meant to have any kind of particularly deep meaning at all. I don't think, incidentally, that many people would say this now. But yeah, I do believe that it really offers endless possibilities and still tends to be underestimated. I think if you were to ask even experienced Shakespeareans today about the plays that they find most important for studying, society or history more broadly, rarely would they name this one.
Yeah, it sort of gets overlooked.
I do agree that I'm sorry?
It sort of gets overlooked, doesn't it? And I mean, it's sort of like, gets tossed aside as, it's one of those early works. And Shakespeare's just sort of trying to find himself as a writer. And it's not really that important, which is why it has comedy in the title. But I think that's all incorrect, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I'm sure it is. For one thing, it's actually, I think we all tend to assume that it's a very early work. It seems to me that, kind of based on, most of the current scholarship of chronology, which is always a little bit speculative, it's not really also early. I mean, he already would have had quite a few important plays behind him. And there's actually a tightness, a rigor in the composition, which, suggests that there's, not lots of experimentation going on. It's, there's quite a bit of confidence, actually, I would say. In the writing, it was, as you mentioned, inspired by Plautus, therefore, kind of following a classical model, a classical in the sense of, a kind of tight unity of place, of action, of time, a bit like French drama, in that respect, maybe closest to French drama. You could compare it maybe a bit to Molière in that respect. And so I think it's actually a play that already deploys a lot of skill and confidence on Shakespeare's part.
I agree, and I think that's because of the audience that it was written for. I mean, it's such a play filled with legal references and both references to both private and public law. I mean, it opens with a scene that is practically a trial of sorts.
Yes.
And thus the title of your piece that you wrote about it, you take right from the Duke of Ephesus in the first scene. Were it not against our laws, And so I feel like it was a play that was written for a specific audience with a specific point, and that being legal aspects of the play written for people who were informed and knew the laws of the land at the time.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And there's a lot of playfulness with legal language in in this particular work, which tends to get lost because of some changes in legal language. So, for example, there's kind of a lot of banter around the language of contract, particularly uh, uh, between Antipholus of Syracuse and Dromio. Now, of course, what's very interesting about their relationship is that it's not a contractual one, right? It's much more in the model of a kind of feudal a relationship. In fact, he's referred to as a slave, Dromio, in a way which is both kind of teasing, but not entirely teasing. Right. And of course, Antipholus is allowed to beat him, which he does at pretty much every opportunity. In fact, that's another interesting element of the play is that, as you rightly mentioned, we would tend to put it, at the end of the most lighthearted. And yet there's more persistent reference to beating and to violence than maybe in any other play. Right. I mean, there are other plays which involve more kind of mass brutality and mass violence. But in the Comedy of Errors, just the constant referring to violence, the threats of beating, the recollections of beating, the descriptions of beating, almost don't stop. And again, with that irony that that it's at the surface level, it's presented as something frivolous and lighthearted. And so there's no contractual relationship between them, right? A contractual relationship is one in which, if you and I enter into a contractual relationship, it means that you and I both have standing in law to do so, that the law recognizes us as independent legal persons, competent to enter into that kind of arrangement, whereas a relationship of servitude, such as that between Antipholus and Dromio, is precisely the opposite of contract, right? A contract can be dissolved. Their relationship cannot be, right? Because it follows more the model of the feudal slave or serf. And so what happens then is precisely because Dromio, both Dromios really, right? Because they are not free agents, they are not fully fledged citizens at all, they don't have the power to enter into contracts. And so instead what we hear from them is a constant ironizing in the language of contract. They're mocking what it would be to be the free, autonomous legal agent that their masters are, and that they are not. So, and this runs not only throughout the play, but through other Shakespearean plays, and particularly comic moments where legal language is used ironically in order to, you could say, really critique the systems of inclusivity and exclusivity that a legal system constructs.
Yes, and we learn at
already the Comedy of Errors is kind of setting us up for that, right? With these inclusive versus exclusive relationships of husband, wife, master, servant, and so forth.
Duke and subject. We learn in the play even that, Antipholus of Ephesus is married to Adriana because the Duke gives her to him almost as sort of a reward for his service in war. We learn from Aegeon that he literally purchases the Dromio twins from their poor parents to serve as servants to his twin boys. And I think we find, because the Dromios and even one of the Antipholus says, just because I joke with you and I have fun with you doesn't change the relationship. And when he uses the term slave, it's almost like a reminder that you serve me, not the other way around type of a scenario. Yeah, and it is very sort of a convoluted relationship, especially when you see Shakespeare throwing these legal layers sort of on top of it or next to it as sort of a, I don't know, comparison perhaps.
Oh, I think your reading is exactly correct. In other words, it's precisely to underscore the inequality in the master-servant relationship that there's constantly ironizing on this notion of equality. And you just cited probably one of the best passages to confirm that, right? Where he has to emphasize to Dromio, we're not equals, even if in certain lighter moments, we may perform a kind of equality, right?
Mm-hmm.
We may feign equality, but don't mistake that for the reality of our relationship, which is an unequal one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the other things I think is very interesting, a deeper layer, perhaps even one that is more thematic, especially when you consider, as I said, I believe that there was a particular audience for this play, is what can be perceived as a conflict between monarchical and parliamentary powers. And that's a really sort of scary, dangerous place to go, isn't it, during the Elizabethan reign?
Oh, yeah. Well, yes. And not only during her reign.
Well, any reign for that matter, right?
Well, I mean, this goes all the way back to King John and even earlier, right? King John of the Magna Carta,
sure.
Right? These constant struggles between the king and the aristocracy. This is really interesting. I mean, this is one of the main themes, in Shakespeare, and particularly in his English histories. And not only there, right? Shakespeare is mindful of an earlier time, long before the Elizabethan period, when the monarch would have simply been a kind of primus inter pares, right? Simply one among equals within the aristocratic class, and the most powerful aristocrats, would not necessarily have seen themselves as much below the monarch, right? The monarch would have just been kind of, leading the pack of independently of autonomously powerful nobles.
And so many of them could claim, well, I have a little bit of royal blood in me because I'm a cousin of that third nephew. And there was so much, I don't want to call it inbreeding, but, so many marriages that were families jockeying for greater power, greater position. And the closer you were in blood to the throne, the more you sort of looked down your nose at others. And there was a lot of that going on to the point where almost everybody was related to everybody in some way through some sort of a marriage or actual blood relatives, right? I mean, it was kind of crazy, that circle of people.
100%. And of course, Shakespeare ironizes on this too in Richard II, right? Where, he says about Bolingbroke to one of the nobles in his court, he is our cousin.
Yeah, right.
And there's always that level where these sort of colossal antagonisms and conflicts are really just kind of family feuds. I think you're absolutely right to point out that even in the Comedy of Errors, again, which most people would not see as a political drama as at all. And again, even when attentive to the legal aspects, would tend to focus on the private law aspects, the contract with the merchant and so forth, the relationship with the wife. But as you said, it all opens in a very public law setting. The criminal case, which is a capital case,
right,
against Aegeon, in which the Duke, mentions what he calls synods, right, as solemn synods as a lawmaking body. And so here clearly we have a reflection. The Duke and the synods are a kind of mirror or echo of the English monarch and the Parliament. And in the Comedy of Errors, exactly who has which lawmaking authority becomes less and less clear the more the Duke speaks. And certainly by the end of the play, where he does pardon Aegeon, having insisted at the beginning of the play that it was simply
I know.
wasn't
Wait a minute.
possible.
I don't. Oh, well, if it weren't for our laws, I would pardon you, but I don't have the power to do that.
Go.
And then at the end of the play, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and pardon you anyway.
Yeah. Which is also a kind of interesting movement, right? It's almost like a little wink to the audience that that the monarchy is growing in power in Shakespeare's time and not losing power, right? And while the rest of the aristocratic class is gradually losing power, right? This is part of the whole story of the emergence of the modern nation state, and the kind of ushering into the period of absolute monarchy, right? Which is, and this is a historical transition, not only in England, right? It's happening in France, it's happening in Spain, which so many of Shakespeare's plays record.
And so you have this like regular theme throughout the play of what you describe as socio-legal dualisms. I think that's a great phrase there. And we've touched on, there's the master servant, the husband, wife. The Aegeon trial is about, being an illegal alien or versus being a native of Ephesus. There are parent-child relationships. We touched, there's the monarch parliamentary suggestion. Buyer-seller is a big one with Angelo the goldsmith and the chain and all of that. But what I think all of this is sort of pointing to throughout the play, not only the legal structures that exist, but perhaps even legal structures that do not yet exist and maybe are even being suggested as positive changes that could happen in the law.
Well, yes, there is. This is another way in which Shakespeare is really witnessing historically monumental change, right from an earlier feudal time, but which is still very much current in his time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, in which legal status and legal relationships are hierarchical, very much dictated by birth and status, and that slowly transforming into what we would today recognize as a more contemporary or modern marketplace world. And plays like the Comedy of Errors. The Comedy of Errors, incidentally, is really the first cousin and the most closely related to the Merchant of Venice. It almost seems to be a blueprint for the Merchant of Venice. And with all the themes that are, again, so frivolously or seemingly frivolously treated in the Comedy of Errors, suddenly, gaining much greater depth in the Merchant of Venice. But it's all the same. It's all the same types of relationships and that very transition, from the medieval into the modern, right? Where feudal relationships, although still very much intact and very much on display in these plays, are also eroding. They're also becoming unstable as, Europe over centuries is transitioning into what we would today recognize as a marketplace world, right? The marketplace where, we've lost a legal order in which our rights, duties, prerogatives, obligations are dictated by birth, by status, and instead all of us are kind of formally legal, or ever more, right? More and more people become formally legal, and yet informally, inequalities and power hierarchies, far from disappearing, simply end up being reinvented. And in fact, I think that's a lot of what's going on in The Merchant of Venice.
Yeah, and you have this shift. You sort of have this shift happening. It doesn't begin with Elizabeth, but it certainly becomes more prevalent under her reign. But you have this shift of what used to be, the 10th Earl of this and the 12th Earl of that and the 17th Earl of this. And suddenly you have the first Earl and the second Earl and the third Earl, where there are these sort of, nouveau riche, as it were, these newly minted noblemen. And at the same time, this growing merchant class that is now being able to rise up into greater positions, including, let's look at William Cecil, Lord Burleigh himself, for instance. He was the son of a tailor, right? And suddenly now he's, Lord High Treasurer of England and been given this noble title. More and more of these wealthier merchants are now being able to afford to send their sons to the Inns of Court to learn not only the law, but also other aspects of society. So there's this sort of, I don't want to call it egalitarian, but in a way, the commercial parts of it sort of are pushing towards a more egalitarian society. And I think he's kind of pointing that out. Yeah?
Well, yeah, I guess, in other words, more and more formally egalitarian, right? Kind of, we're all equal on paper.
Sure.
It's kind of, this
in
this
theory
endless paradox of equality before the law, and yet all sorts of inequalities are just reinvented, right? And again, that's why I think the Merchant of Venice is so revealing in that respect. On the one hand, Venice, the Merchant of Venice is in some ways you could say his most modern play. Right, where everything is just market driven. There's no aristocracy, which is named, unlike the Comedy of Errors, right? So Merchant of Venice clearly taking the whole thing a step further. There's no named aristocracy, and yet, in a sense, is obviously an aristocracy. It's just not a lineal, feudal, medieval aristocracy by blood. Instead, money determines everything. It's the marketplace that determines everything. And within that marketplace world, everyone in the Merchant of Venice is kind of jockeying for position, right? From obviously Portia, who needs to do everything possible to get from this backwater Belmont into the very heights of the Venetian elite.
Yeah.
And even the servant Jobbo, who kind of ironizes on all of this, and he's going to leave Shylock in favor of Bassanio, who's a debtor, right? In some ways, a kind of a curious move, but because there's a perceived sense of a kind of upward mobility there. And so, yes. So the Merchant of Venice gives us a world where formal legal equality is growing and growing, again, perhaps more than in any other Shakespearean play, and yet the social here of the socio-legal is everybody now kind of sucked into this new marketplace world where they themselves just reinvent hierarchies, reinvent what it means to be an insider or an outsider, the oppressed or the oppressor, and so forth. And so in that respect, I think really the Comedy of Errors just paves the way, just kind of rolls out the red carpet for the Merchant of Venice.
Do you
and then I guess maybe if you want to make them a trilogy, then Timon of Athens would be the third piece of that triptych.
Yeah, wow, that's I love that. That actually is a very interesting way to view those three plays as like three parts of sort of the same type of message with increasing urgency or greater observation. And perhaps one of the reasons why Comedy of Errors is viewed as such an early work is we do know, we have record that the play was presented at Gray's Inn during the Christmas revels of 1594. And at that time, the name Shakespeare was brand new. I mean, Venus and Adonis had been printed in 1593, where we see the name William Shakespeare in print on a piece of literature for the very first time. The following year, Lucrece is printed earlier in 94. And now by December, we have the Comedy of Errors being performed at Gray's Inn in front of not only the members of Gray's Inn, but the invited Middle Templars as well. And the play becomes the namesake of what goes down in history as the Night of Errors. Who is this guy that is writing a play full of legal terms and concepts, outwardly suggesting to a packed room full of members of the Inns of Court and the elites of society that the law needs to change and that it should reflect a better position for everyone. I mean, that's pretty revolutionary. How does he gain access to this venue in order to deliver this erudite message to the men of his country who most needed to hear the message?
Well, I think these are always among the most difficult questions, which seem to just spawn endless arguments among the experts. This old question of what did the author intend, right? Or what was the author's real message? And I guess my own view, and I mean, people will be writing about, what Shakespeare really intended until the end of time, I think. Or what was Shakespeare's own preferred model of law or politics? Was he a monarchist? Was he a Roman Republican? And so on and so forth. I guess my own view is altogether skeptical. I kind of do see, but again, I know this is open to criticism, but I kind of do see Shakespeare in the artist's role, that is kind of criticizing everything, scrutinizing everything, but never taking position, at least in the works that we have, right? Whether in his lived experience he had occasion to speak out on particular issues, that, as far as I know, has never been confirmed or even suggested.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of just these great mysteries about his biography. And to your question, who is this man, right? And so in the case of a play like the Comedy of Errors, clearly he's holding the law up to scrutiny, and in a room full of jurists, and to scrutiny, in ways that are not very flattering. And so you might say holding it up to criticism, but whether he is thereby proposing some alternative, some better version of the law, some law reform, I would always stay very agnostic on that kind of question, although I'd always be open to the next theory.
Okay, and you reference, I mean, and rightly so, in your work in your writings on this, you reference Aristotle, Plato, Plautus, of course. These are men whose works were only available in Latin translations at best, and chiefly only available to members, the aristocratic members of the audience, who would obviously know those works and their contents. Is the author using this work to sort of reference classical education in an effort to affect changes in the law before an audience that actually has the power to potentially affect those changes? I mean, these are the most powerful men in England in this audience, right?
Well, that he, as I said, that he's clearly holding the law up to scrutiny and kind of showing it warts and all. And in many ways, showing the law, what's fascinating about the Comedy of Errors, as I said, in its formal composition, there's a kind of perfection to it, right? Because again, we don't always associate Shakespeare with that kind of writing. We usually see him as, we usually celebrate the fact that, sort of unlike French drama, there are lots of loose ends in Shakespeare, lots of little tangents, not to mention the fact that you get, different versions, quarto and folio. It's often unclear how they would fit together, or if they're meant to fit together, right? What would be the real version? And the Comedy of Errors, again, curiously, it has a kind of classicism, a kind of, elegant perfection in its writing, and yet at the same time, again, you scratch beneath the surface, and what it's really exposing, is a legal system which is full of faults, which is full of arbitrariness, which gives the imprimatur to forms of oppression and exploitation. Was this intended? Who knows? But it's certainly curious. That this kind of masterpiece of formal, authorial, compositional perfection is actually becoming the vehicle for displaying endless imperfection in the law and in the society that law governs. And here, I think maybe we could draw an interesting parallel to a play like Troilus and Cressida, which is the very model of a play adopting a kind of classical predecessors, above all Homer's Iliad, although of course Aristotle is famously anachronistically referenced there too.
Yeah.
And yet curiously also displayed for a legal audience. Here, of course, the topic is the inanity of war, right? At a time when, war was always on people's minds in late Elizabethan and Jacobean England, and in Europe at that time generally.
Sure.
And of course, the law of war is not only of interest in Troilus and Cressida. Of course, there's this famous manipulation of law with which Henry V, the play Henry V begins. And of course, the problems of manipulating the law in Richard II. And so, this kind of difficult fit between formal law and, the brutality of actual circumstances, I think, is a common preoccupation. I think it's one of the reasons why, Machiavelli always seems to be on Shakespeare's mind, right? Machiavelli, is the master kind of anti-legalist. My point here is not that Machiavelli himself, as a living, breathing person, didn't believe in law or would have tried to subvert it, but rather Machiavelli understands the law as itself just a kind of tool in the hands of the powerful.
Right. A tool. I think Machiavelli, we use his name so wildly now to describe so many different types of behavior, but I think truly he saw almost everything as a tool that could be manipulated and used to the advantage of those who knew how to use it properly. Thus, when he writes The Prince, he's basically writing a guidebook, right? It's almost like Castiglione's Courtier, but for a different audience, right? It's, they're very similar. They're sort of guidebooks, aren't they?
100%. Even as far back as Rousseau was quite clear that Machiavelli was not advocating; he was unmasking. And in that respect, he was empowering us by showing, by taking away the veil of, the high Christian theological justifications of right and wrong and good and bad, and showing us that, all of this, all of the window dressing of law and ethics and Christian theology were really just, tools for the manipulation of power. Which probably again speaks to us today like nothing else. And I think this is constantly in evidence, throughout the Shakespearean corpus. Again, Henry V being, I think the archetype. It's there's almost a boast in that play about how law is being used simply to justify a lot of lawlessness.
Well, this is an extremely bold choice.
Once again, with the irony that for generations Henry V would be hailed as Shakespeare's model monarch, and Shakespeare really pulled the wool over our eyes for a very, very long time. It's really only in the last few decades that people have seen Henry V as a purely Machiavellian character.
Well, these are awfully bold choices, and especially when it comes to Comedy of Errors. Of course, we don't know how or why Comedy of Errors was chosen to be performed that night in December 1594 in front of this gathering of innsmen in a packed house at the Great Hall in Gray's Inn. But you could just imagine, like, hey, we want you to write us a play or a play you already have. We want to have performed during this multiple night of revels. And this is the play that is chosen. And it is sort of masked with sort of this, lighthearted comic moments that can be very funny. Obviously one of the funniest moments is when Dromio is describing the kitchen maid as spherical, and then goes on about how parts of her body, are reminiscent of areas of the world, which is one of the best, monologues ever, as far as comic effect goes. But also there are these, layers of slapstick, let's call it. I mean, we talk about the physical violence, and yeah, there's a lot of beating going on. I don't know that the beating is, it's almost like a great grandfather of the Three Stooges in that aspect. So it probably finds its roots in Commedia dell'arte, where they, even literally had slapsticks that they used for, sound effects and comic effect. But underneath is this really bold choice to go, hey, all of you jurists, this is what you're a part of. This is the society you're a part of. And here are the flaws of this aspect of society. Do you think that might be why the evening resulted in such historic chaos after the performance? Did he know what he was doing? Did he do it on purpose? Or was this just to be, fun entertainment, and it sort of blew up in everybody's face? It's kind of a crazy story.
Well, yeah, and there are all sorts of places in Shakespeare where Shakespeare does, poke fun at lawyers, at the judicial profession. Um, uh, uh, there's the kind of the image of a sort of self-satisfied complacency in As You Like It, in the Seven Stages of Man, right? Where just before the man enters old age, right? He's become, the round-bellied judge, right?
Yes.
Right. But there are so many other places.
Lining
as well.
his coat with capons, I believe, is the line, right? He's lining his coat with capons, meaning he's eating so much that it's providing the lining to the inner side of his coat.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And right. Or I think far more poignantly is in the famous Cade's Rebellion in Henry VI Part 2.
Sure.
Where there's where the critique is truly poignant. Where, I mean, depending on performance, I suppose, Henry VI Part 2 is not one of the most performed plays. I can imagine there would have been performances where, which cast a solely negative light on the justice who is being subjected to this sort of lynch mob, but it can also be played in a very poignant way. One can take seriously the fact that that Lord Say, that the justice who's facing this mob, genuinely believes that he spent his career trying to do justice and to poor people and to do right by them. But from a poor person's perspective, this can all be very much cast into doubt, right? I mean, here you get into really a kind of full-blown Marxist reading, where those in power may genuinely feel that they're pursuing justice, that they're pursuing morality, all the while, in fact, participating in a very unjust legal and political order.
So part of it is about the messenger too, then, right? When we talk about like Cade's Rebellion, for instance, and you look at that scene, yeah, it's often played for great comic effect. And, of course, the most famous line, the first thing we do is kill all the lawyers.
Yeah.
And, people find that to be a funny line, and especially even lawyers know that line really well, and they joke about it quite often. But truthfully, if you scratch beneath the surface, what you're seeing is, if you look at the messengers there, they're idiots. They're uneducated. They have no clue what they're talking about. They make terrible assumptions. They have come to this power through, mob rule and revolt, and they're not to be trusted in any way because they have literally no knowledge, no education about what they're actually talking about. And it is sort of poignant. It's actually quite frightening even. It's almost like the same moment you see in Julius Caesar, where Cinna the poet is torn to shreds by the unruly mob, right? I'm not that guy. I'm not the Senator Cinna. I'm Cinna the poet. Don't kill me. And they kill him anyway, right? So is this sort of a warning that he's giving to these aristocratic men and these members of the Inns of Court, who are the most powerful men in the country? If you're not careful, this is what we risk.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's certainly a very, very plausible reading. Uh, because when the mob, right? Remember, I mean, it's true what you're saying about the mob in Cade's rebellion. That right, these are illiterate, uneducated peasants. They're swept up. Not only scarcely aware of what they're doing, but again, in a kind of the dynamic of a saturnalia, really just kind of overthrowing the whole social order, just kind of for the fun of it. And
Yes.
it can be staged very much as just kind of a party atmosphere, and so yes, this is frightening, right? That it's in that kind of party atmosphere that somebody can be put to death, and yet. I think some would say that, what they're, this is not so much the murder of an individual, but rather kind of revenge on a class, on a powerful class, on a powerful elite, which has often mismanaged the realm and has not often done right by the poorest, right? Remember, earlier in that play, in Act Two of Henry VI, Part Two, where the petitioners are petitioning the Duke of Suffolk, and he and the Queen respond so disdainfully, and even threaten to beat one of the peasants. And so I think this is what's fantastic about Shakespeare, is that he never descends into caricature. It never quite becomes just the dumb and dangerous mass. For all of their folly and ignorance, there is also a genuine resentment about injustice which is driving them. And at the flip side of that, for Lord Say, for all of the genuineness of his career, which we can just assume for argument's sake, again, that he did try to do right by the poor, that he did try to do justice, that he bent over backwards, that tears could move him. And yet the fact is that, for all of that virtue, he is a member of an elite class, and benefits arbitrarily from the privileges of that class. And so this is, I think this is what's really valuable in the way Shakespeare paints these scenes, is that they never just descend into one-sided caricatures. There's always a yes, but. Right. A bit like the way, Iago in the very, very last minute, does, confess, no one ever quite falls entirely into, a good or an evil or a just or an unjust or a right or a wrong. There's always another side to everyone's coin.
I mean, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, even Edmund in Lear, who starts off by saying, well, it's society's fault that I'm this way because I've been labeled a bastard, and so I have to behave like one. Richard III, his opening monologue, look, I was built this way. I came out crooked, and so I have no choice but to be who I am, type of a thing. Yeah, there's a lot of equivocation going on in the villains in the stories.
Yeah, and and that's really, I think, the beauty of it. Unlike a playwright like Marlowe, who tends, I think, more easily to fall into caricature. I think it's precisely that. I guess it's precisely that kind of creative, pregnant ambiguity in Shakespeare. The willingness of his plays to leave it to us to ponder these things. Which leads me to believe that he's not necessarily pushing a message or pushing an alternative, but rather just exploring all of the ambiguities, all of the intricacies, of any of these highly charged situations.
Well, he delivers this message through the comedy of errors to this group of Innsmen, these jurists, these most powerful men, and at Gray's Inn, I mean, some of the most powerful were members of Gray's Inn, including William Cecil and his son. The list is crazy. Francis Bacon. I mean, the list of Gray's Inn members who rose to prominence is incredible. And here they all are at this event watching this play, and the evening falls apart into chaos to the point that it goes down in history as a night of infamy, the night of errors. And the following night, they put the producer of the evening's entertainment on trial. They never identify who he is. They just refer to him as a sorcerer. And they put him on trial for having conjured such discord among the innsmen the previous night with this performance of this play. Was the author the producer / sorcerer? Why do you think they never identified him by name in all of these proceedings? And in the end, he was found guilty by a trial before the Prince of Purpool, who was, sort of this, king of misrule for the several nights. But then he gets pardoned by that same Prince of Misrule in a lavish ceremony designed to sort of further the satirical attack on feudalism, while also setting the entire event aside as nothing more than just a theatrical experience. It's a really crazy story. How does this guy gain access to these men? How does he get away with these statements that he makes? Why is he not identified if he is the producer who is also then placed on trial? Would they bother? I mean, it's just none of it really makes any sense, does it?
Well, and to add to the confusion, or to the wonderment, or what's interesting is that if I had to guess, I mean, I haven't studied this, but if I had to guess, I would say the Comedy of Errors may also be the play that most frequently refers to sorcery.
Yes, it does. In fact, it's true. Right? and there's sort of that. There's that legend of Ephesus, right? It's an Ephesian thing. I think they're actually, it's connected back to the Bible, right? And St. Paul and his letters to the Ephesians. There is this reference there regularly. In fact, it's I think it's one of the Dromios who was like, it's Dromio of Syracuse. He's like, this is an enchanted land where they're full of sorcerers. Antipholus of Syracuse actually tries to cast spells against the concubine because he sees her as the temptation of Satan. You're right. There is a lot of that going on in the play.
Yeah. Particularly because, the town of Ephesus, although, a bit like Venice, we know in a sense it's really just London that he's talking about, right? And yet, by placing it in this, quasi-legendary, town of Ephesus, of course, we know it's a real town, and that I guess that would have been known. As you say, there's the obvious biblical heritage. On the other hand, at that particular time, how much the average Englishman could have told you about the actual city of Ephesus, I suspect not much.
Sure.
And so, that just kind of, opens up a space for it to project all sorts of fantasy onto it. And, along with fantasy can come, themes of sorcery, witchcraft, deception, illusion, right? Antipholus of Syracuse in particular, precisely because, right, he's unaware of what's actually going on. He just he takes it all for a kind of illusion that they're walking through. So whether this was deliberate, whether Shakespeare already had some sense, that there were darker goings on among some members of the Inns of Court, that would be very interesting to explore, but I'm not sure I'm the person to do that.
Well, the thing that strikes me the most, I think, when you put all of these pieces of the puzzle together, this night of infamy that is recorded by Francis Bacon, by others who were there that evening, and obviously, again, some of the most powerful men of all of England were at these revels, were at this event, watched the play. watched it all descend into debauchery after the play. The next night, placing the responsible person for having presented the play on trial in this elaborate theatrical ceremony, find him guilty, but then pardon him of his offenses. Would not and should not that have skyrocketed the author to the top of society? Like, wouldn't that put him on the map forever with anyone who was anyone in Elizabethan society at the time? I mean, this is a gigantic event with all of these principal players that becomes this huge to-do. And you would think that everybody in all of the upper echelons of society would be speaking the name Shakespeare the very next day.
Yeah. Yeah, you're certainly persuading me. I think, sure. I mean, this might have been a classic case of there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Right? Absolutely. I mean, and all these people in that room, I mean, I can't imagine the names, but you know, it had to be the who's who. I mean, when you look at that room today, the Great Hall at Gray's Inn, the gallery of portraits in there is definitely the who's who of Elizabethan England. And a part of that was because, you know, Elizabeth was the patron of that particular inn of court, patroness, I should say, of that particular inn of court. Yeah. So it was the most prestigious. It was the one everyone wanted to be a part of. We don't have any evidence that she herself attended these revels or was there. That would be really interesting if we could find some proof of that, because, but I doubt it because of the proceedings, the way they're recorded with the whole Prince of Purpool. They're literally, I think, sort of stabbing at her and the monarchy in some of the speeches that are given by his cabinet members, as it were, his secretaries of the different areas of rule. But it's really an incredible moment in history. And this play, again, as we mentioned from the beginning, I think deserves so much deeper analysis. And in your work, you really dive into, we've only scratched on the surface of some of the other things that you point out in your writing. So I want to encourage listeners to go find that and read it if this has intrigued them, because I think it should. But I'd like to shift gears now to your book, The Concept of Injustice. I mean, you have several books, but it's the one that tended to catch my eye the most because I think it connects to Shakespeare the most. You notably reference the works of Shakespeare in the book, as well as others who came before him, again, Aristotle and Plato, and those who were obviously influenced by him, including Kant, Hegel, Marx, Rawls. Tell us a little more about that book, and then I have a couple questions I'd like to ask you about it.
Yeah, sure. Although just before I do, can I come in with one final remark?
Of course, sure, absolutely.
Very quickly, which is that, you know, in Shakespeare, you always want to look for the powerful women, because Elizabeth might somehow be lurking behind them. And the abbess enters the Comedy of Errors kind of like a Deus Ex Machina.
Yes, absolutely.
You know? And although what's very interesting is that if you take all the anxiety that was surrounding Elizabeth, you know, simply as a woman on the throne, and was this God's will, and would they be punished for having a woman on the throne, and all of these anxieties, you know, the fact that the abbess goes back to her husband, in effect, without saying so, renounces her position of power in the community and simply goes back to being a wife, right? Just as Adriana herself does, right? Adriana, for a brief moment, kind of commands the scene when it seems that Antipholus has gone crazy, right? But then, of course, reverts to her position of wife. And, you know, the question of the status between them is a point of conflict, really, from beginning to end. Okay, but onto the next topic. Yeah, in the book, The Concept of Injustice, I kind of start with the seeming logical necessity that we can only understand justice and injustice as mutually exclusive, right? This would seem common sense. It seems that we would not even be able to use those words except insofar as one precludes the other, right? And so we can have injustice only when justice somehow is marred, and we can have justice only when injustice is somehow remedied, right? So that would seem to be not just common sense, but kind of logically insuperable.
It's sort
And
of like
so,
almost like a yin and yang type of philosophy, right? Or even laws of physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction type of a concept.
well, I guess that's more the direction in which the book wants to move, right? Which is that we cannot see justice and injustice as strict logical opposites, as mutually exclusive. We have to understand them much more as constructing each other. And when we go through much of the famous writing on justice, in the Western tradition, and you could say the first systematic writing on justice in the Western tradition, it clearly is with Plato. Of course, people would have been concerned about justice long before Plato, but Plato is the first one who believes that we can make a systematic study of it and tries to do this. And people have been trying to do it ever since.
Yes, they have.
And sorry.
Yes, they have, and quite unsuccessfully in some cases too. I would argue.
Yeah. As Plato already anticipated, right? In Plato's famous Republic, what we sometimes forget is several times, I know I've counted at least 3, he's very clear that his ideal society in the Republic actually could never really come about. And right, and in other words, that that a regime of optimal justice can never really come about. In fact, it was precisely on reading those passages in Plato's Republic, that I was induced to think, oh, right, okay, the only way Plato thinks we can contemplate justice is by means of a society which he thinks could never really exist, even leaving aside the ways in which we could pick apart the particulars of his model society, which has been done for the last 2,500 years incessantly. Mm-hmm. For me, that's already a tip-off that the relationship between justice and injustice is not simply one of mutual exclusion, that it's much more intricate than that. And so, for example, one of the things that Plato was doing in the Republic, which again I read as a highly ironic work, because the more he keeps talking about how we achieve this kind of just society, the more he keeps throwing in, and he knows he's throwing in, some pretty horrendous elements, right? I mean, starting at the very beginning, where you have this whole as he's starting to form this this class structure, and it's guardian class, and the guardian class starts not with philosopher kings, it starts with these sort of soldiers who he compares to sort of vicious guard dogs. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And and he says that because of the way people live, there's going to have to be conquest of foreign territories. He front loads all of this stuff.
He's definitely he's an elitist, right? I mean, come on, he sets himself above the lesser beings who don't contemplate things as well and as strongly as he does, and he sort of says, well, and in order to make society conform to these ideals, we have to make society conform to these ideals. It's sort of like communism, isn't it? I mean, it's what we've seen throughout history of these regimes that go, you don't know what's good for you, we do know what's good for you, and we're going to force it upon you.
Well, the notion of communism in Plato's Republic is actually very, very interesting because he comes up with a kind of his Republic, and very few people I think have noticed this, because most of the people who study Plato are classicists. They're not constitutional lawyers.
Right.
But he comes up with a kind of separation of powers which is quite remarkable, where the people who have all the political power have no wealth, no property, and the people who have the property and the wealth have no power. That, I think, is actually quite an impressive move, right? Again, and as Plato himself says more than once, completely unrealistic. But there is a kind of balancing which you don't actually pick up on, kind of first or second time around, because it's true. The first thing that strikes us is, yes, this very, very strict hierarchy. And yes, what seems to be an intellectual elitism, and a sense that almost no one would really have the qualifications to govern. And of course, Aristotle really picks up Plato precisely on that point. Be that all as it may, I think the moves that Plato makes in the Republic and elsewhere in his writing hint to me that it would be too simplistic to look at justice and injustice simply as logical opposites. And instead, what intrigues me more, although, sorry, let me just add one more step. And yet, I think, everyone who's followed Plato, right, from Aristotle right up to our own time, has, tried to understand justice, right, according to, some sort of model, right? In other words, we have a long tradition of political philosophy, which kind of, tries to come up with best possible models of society, meaning greatest possible justice, which would mean as little injustice as can be achieved. Although I think Plato himself had already suggested that this is a faulty step. But I think very few of the people who followed him noticed that he was saying this, and much more literally tended to kind of fashion these model societies as, a greatest possible negation of injustice, without considering that justice itself, right, because justice itself is always somehow going to be structural. And because we are not gods, because we're humans, because structures always are going to end up having inconsistencies, hypocrisies, arbitrariness, institutional implementation, will themselves become the engines, the sources of injustice, and not merely the negation of injustice, as they're always sold to us.
This is what Shakespeare, and this is what Shakespeare picks up on, right? I mean, and this is what Shakespeare picks up on, because that's what he keeps telling us over and over again through his works, is that same concept, this same thing of we're all fallible, we're all, for a lack of a better word, we're all sinners, and we're all going to screw this up. And here are the ways that we commonly screw it up. And so here are the cautionary tales I want to present to you about how we can be better about not screwing it up. I mean, that's kind of a simplistic way of putting it, but I feel like that's the common theme we see when it comes to justice and injustice in the writings of Shakespeare.
Well, and that's exactly right. Yeah, after Plato, Shakespeare was my next port of call in thinking about these problems, because, or I should say, in reading about Shakespeare, and again, in reading these various theories, Shakespeare was really a Republican. No, Shakespeare was really a monarchist. Shakespeare was really an absolutist, right? And the more you read these studies, the more you see they're just doing selective readings, and they're leaving out all of the passages in Shakespeare that would completely contradict whatever theory they have, right? And I kind of think that Shakespeare displays many political models, right? And usually in a way so as to contrast them with other political models, right? Again, monarch versus parliament, emperor versus senate, duke versus synod, and so on, right? And what I think Shakespeare is doing above all is holding up every model to a kind of searing scrutiny, and showing every model to have to really already have the seeds of its own undoing, in a kind of Hegelian sense. That no model, no political model, simply holds itself open to being perfected and perfected and perfected until we get to the just society. And that's not the way to think about justice at all. And we have to actually be much more attentive to the fact that whatever our own model is, will always have the seeds of its own injustice. That was the point I wanted to get across.
Uh-huh.
In fact, I reiterated that point in my last book, but as you said, aside from one or two quotes, it's not a book about Shakespeare. But it's a bit of an obsession of mine. Right? Because we're so accustomed to the politics of, here's my model and here's why the other models are wrong. And of course, I understand that, sometimes politics has to work that way because you want to win voters. So you don't want to be spending too much time on all your own faults. But if we want to get beyond that and really start thinking seriously, if we take justice seriously, then we have to get beyond that. And we have to learn to think about the injustice that is structurally inherent in whatever model of justice we ourselves are nurturing and advocating.
Is it possible? I mean, because you mentioned, and you're right. There are anyone, you hear this a lot from a lot of different scholars. Is the beauty about Shakespeare is everyone can claim him and describe him as the way they see fit. And you're right. The selective reading is very real. And cognitive dissonance is a very real thing. Tunnel vision is also a real thing when it comes to Shakespeare. He's Catholic. No, he's Protestant. No, he's a Republican.
Yeah.
No, he's whatever anybody wants him to be is one of the things that some people say is the beauty of him. But is it possible that instead of trying to define him in one way, we instead try to look at him as he would have truly been, which is an evolving human being who perhaps changed his views on these topics throughout his lifetime? And we might even have a clearer sense of the chronology of the plays if we look at them through that lens. Oh, look, here he is where he's definitely a feudalist and a monarchist. But here he is where he is suddenly becoming more and more Republican. And here he is where he's suddenly becoming more egalitarian. Is it perhaps that's the truth, is that his views changed throughout his life and throughout his writings?
Perhaps. But I think another way I would look at it, if we look at other writers, whom we immediately associate with, the critique of politics and of law and society, in their own time. If we think about people, about writers, from, Corneille, Racine, Sheila, Émile Zola, Victor Hugo, right? I mean, the list goes on and on. And I think in this particular respect, they're not the true, if I may use this phrase, the truly great ones, or at least I think are very much like Shakespeare in that regard. I'm not sure what Zola or Victor Hugo or Sheila thought was the best possible political system, because I don't think it's what they're trying to do. I think a good artist, is just, as I said before, holding the system or various systems or competing ideas up to scrutiny, holding competing worldviews up to scrutiny. Right, Sheila does this so well in his telling of the story of Mary Queen of Scots. It's not, I don't think he's so concerned about taking sides, but as contrasting, historical shifts, different views of the world, and showing them both for their beauty and their terror.
Yeah, I guess that is sort of an interesting way of looking at it, that as the artist, they're not suggesting this is the correct way. And certainly, again, that would connect to Plato, because I don't know, as you say, Plato prefaces with, there is no correct way because it's impossible to find the perfection. And perhaps that's the philosophy of Shakespeare. I mean, there have been plenty of scholars who have connected that Shakespeare obviously read Plato, was influenced by Plato, definitely also influenced by Aristotle. There's no doubt in my mind that that's true. I see him as a classicist in a lot of ways, but I also see him as sort of having this constant theme of injustice, and in a way that feels to me like he feels that there is some grave injustice that has been committed, and he's trying to correct it in some way. What do you think, if you had to place your thumb on it, what type of grave injustice do you think mattered most to Shakespeare that needed to be fixed? Is it the idea of monarchical mercy that we see that kind of pops up over and over again, whether it's Measure for Measure or Comedy of Errors or Merchant of Venice, or where would you put your thumb on it if you had to?
Well, I mean, I have to wonder. As to this theme of mercy, maybe I'm a bit of a skeptic. You give good examples there. Whether it's the Duke of Ephesus or the Duke of Venice, or the Duke in Measure for Measure. From the power to dispense a pardon is the power not to do it, and so there's always a kind of absolutism. I think this comes across most clearly in Measure for Measure, right? The Dukes of Ephesus and Venice, it's unclear how constrained they are. We have particularly the Duke of Venice, suggests that he himself is subject to law, that he's not an entirely free agent. Exactly what the limits are, I think, are left deliberately ambiguous. In Measure for Measure, I think it's much clearer that the power to pardon is a power not to pardon. It's highly discretionary, and it's some of Shakespeare's great tragedies that explore this notion of discretion as a kind of attribute of the of absolutism, right? I mean, I guess the great example here is King Lear, right? Who uses his discretion, who has a kind of absolute power, and who uses his discretion in ways that are truly damaging,
Yeah.
And rather ridiculous.
Yes.
At the same time, to get closer to your question, when Lear says, "I've taken too little care of these," right? Thinking, seeing, Edgar in the guise of a madman. But when he says of these, he means, the people at the very bottom, the poorest, the most wretched. Of course, again, picking up a theme, from Henry, from the Henry VI trilogy, particularly Henry VI Part 2. And so so this brings us back to our theme, or even the supposedly comical beatings of Dromio. And so I think there's no doubt that I don't think Shakespeare locates injustice in any one place. I do, as much as it may be falling out of fashion now through overuse, I think the concept of systemic or structural injustice would have come as no surprise to Shakespeare. Right. I do think he portrays the most salient forms of injustice as structural, as systemic. I think in some ways that's some of the best of the ways in which he introduces us to politics and to political problems and to law and to legal problems.
And to quote from Hamlet, and something that
people might answer your question completely differently, right? You have biographers recently, who say Shakespeare was really Shylock, right? Or Shylock is really Shakespeare, right? In other words, this kind of a member of this kind of aspirational and constantly frustrated middle class, which has great talent and ability and education. And little to show for it in the political and legal world, well, particularly the political world, right? And so it's through the courts that they assert whatever power they have. And yeah, I think that's all plausible. And Shylock certainly is obviously a target of injustice, of cruelty, of arbitrary exercise of power. But I don't think I would go so far as to say that Shakespeare identifies more with someone like Shylock than he does with, Simcox, right, in Henry VI, Part Two, or with other people who are dealt with very unjustly, even with Dromio. If we push aside all of the laughter, or the Dromios, if we push aside all the laughter.
Well, and your point about Edgar and playing poor Tom.
About, what's the one, what's the one injustice with which Shakespeare might have been truly concerned? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's all right. I just was going to point out, you make a great point when you talk about Edgar in the guise of poor Tom, and Lear saying, we haven't done enough. And one of the things I think about Lear is, and what I think about Shakespeare as an observer of humanity, for instance. So, Lear could be argued as the first Alzheimer patient ever put to paper. And then here, that same sort of theme of madness where you have, poor Tom, Edgar pretending to be this, mad homeless person, which we see so commonly today. There are so many major communities now. You can walk down the street and find somebody who looks like a poor Tom who is raving to themselves or shouting at a street lamp. And so now we have, this whole concept of mental illness that he also has captured and sees as being an injustice in society that we don't recognize it and do more for it. It really is this revolutionary mind who does witness I'd say the duality of justice and injustice, and might even in some way refer to them as twins who are inseparable from birth. And then I think we see in Hamlet, some of the great clues to the entire canon, I feel, are in Hamlet. I feel like Hamlet is sort of telling us how to interpret the rest of the canon sometimes. And something that's been a theme throughout this episode as we've had our conversations is a quote that keeps popping up in my head is to hold the mirror up to nature, right? Is what Hamlet says is the actor's job. And maybe the author himself felt that was his responsibility as well.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. Sure. The mirror for magistrates, right? Which I guess gets it, which was a whole literary genre, and I guess is most eloquently reproduced, in the famous, in the famous decarnation of Richard II, where he smashes the mirror.
Yeah. Well, Eric, this has been such a fascinating conversation. I can't thank you enough for agreeing to join us and share your insights with my listeners. We could talk for hours. There are so many subjects that you are so well versed in. And I hope that there's a possibility that we might actually meet face to face. I'm going to be in London in May for our big event at Gray's Inn, in the Great Hall of Gray's Inn. We're going to study some of these plays and some of the legal aspects of them right there in the place where the famous Night of Errors took place. So we'll connect offline, and perhaps we can share a pint or two together while I'm there in May.
Yeah, just keep me posted. Let me know as soon as you can, so I don't book something probably which would be far less interesting.
Well, great. We'll be there May. I'll be there May 6th through the 11th, I believe. And the event, of course, is Saturday, May 9th. So there might be a window in there where we could connect together.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope so. That sounds wonderful.
Thank you again. It's been a wonderful conversation.
It's been my pleasure too, Stephen.
Once again, our thanks to Professor Heinze for taking the time to share his expertise with us. As you know, we pride ourselves here at Don't Quill the Messenger with our ability to line up interesting and knowledgeable guests from around the globe as we seek to discover the truth regarding this enduring literary mystery. But of course, we can't do it without all of you, nor would we want to. You are our muse, and you are what makes this all happen every fortnight, especially those of you who have been and continue to be Patreon patrons of the show at our Patreon page. We certainly appreciate all of you for continuing to follow us on this journey of exploration. That said, it is time to call upon our very own producer Jake to spin the wheel of destiny and declare our April 2026 Quiller of the Month. Jake, make the magic happen.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and hello to all the listeners out there. Thank you so much for sticking with us here and being a part of this Quiller community. If you don't know what this is that we do once a month, well, then you got to head on over to patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger and find out each and every month all of our eligible Quillers have their name put into the random name generator, our Wheel of Names, and a winner is chosen at random from those eligible Quillers, and you get an item you're choosing from the shop, as well as the accolades of being the official Quiller of the month for that month. In your name is in the history books, and as we know, nobody ever gets the history books wrong. So without further ado, all eligible Quillers are loaded up, and the wheel is spinning, and our official April 2026 Quiller of the month is Neal Riesterer. Neal Riesterer. I still don't know if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, but I do recall I struggled equally. So the last time Neal was the Quiller, which makes me think this is Neal's second victory. Let me look. You know, I love a stat. Neal, last September was the last time Neal was the Quiller of the month, which just goes to show you that there's no limit to the amount of times you can win. It is completely randomized. And the fates decide. Thank you so much, Neal. Thank you so much to all of our Quillers who continue to support the program. We could not, would not, should not do this without you. Neal, keep your eye on your email. And everybody else out there, I hope that you are doing great. I hope that you are finding all of the love, the hope, and the fight, and everything that you need to exist in today's world. Thank you so much. And back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Jake. Thank you to this month's Lucky Quiller. Thank you again to all of you for tuning in. And thank you again to our guest, Professor Eric Heinze. It is so hard to believe we are already in April of this year. So much has already happened, and we have so much more in store for you. So if you want to stay informed about current episodes, special events, links to guest information, future episodes, bonus features, and all things Quiller in nature, be sure to subscribe to the Patreon page. You can do that for free, or you can also look at the various donation levels there. Or you might want to join our email subscriber list, or both. As always, we promise not to bombard your inbox with excessive emails, and we never, ever share our lists with anyone, ever. You can find all the information and subscription links right at our homepage, don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com. That's don'tquillthepodcast.com. And until next time, fellow Quillers, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at don'tquillthepod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.